The prison warden, a man who'd seen it all, could only stare, his mouth hanging open, a hollow cavity in a face suddenly stripped of all authority. The most powerful families in the state, untouchable for decades, dynasties built on concrete and shadows, had just been dismantled, their empires crashing down in a symphony of screeching alarms and frantic, incoming calls, all orchestrated by the one man they had tried so desperately to break. He didn't use a weapon, not a single bullet was fired, no overt threat was made. He used their own suffocating arrogance against them, turning their greatest strength into the very fulcrum of their downfall. And it all started with a simple, calculated act of public humiliation. The warden stood frozen, a statue of impotence in his own office, his mind scrambling, failing to catch up, to comprehend the elegant, brutal simplicity of what had just happened. To understand how we got here, how a system built on illicit power, a fortress of corruption meticulously maintained for generations, was brought down from the inside by a ghost in a uniform, we need to go back 3 months, to a day that began like any other but ended with the arrival of the architect of its end. Major Kalen Shaw was a man forged in the unforgiving world of military logistics and psychological operations, a realm where wars were won not on the battlefield but in the ledger books and in the minds of the enemy. His career was a quiet, classified collection of impossible tasks made possible, of supply chains built across impassable deserts overnight and insurgencies quieted not with bullets and bombs, but with leverage, with a careful application of pressure on hidden psychological fractures. He was an architect of systems, a man who saw the world not as a series of chaotic, unpredictable events, but as a complex machine, a clockwork of gears and levers. And when a machine was broken, when its gears were grinding with corruption and greed, he was the one they sent to fix it, or, if necessary, to meticulously take it apart, piece by piece. This latest assignment, though, was unlike any before, a strange and unsettling deviation from his usual deployments. He wasn't being shipped off to a foreign dust bowl or a humid jungle halfway across the world, but to the decaying concrete heart of his own country, a place festering with a rot that felt both familiar and deeply alien. His destination, Blackwood Federal Penitentiary, a name that was a byword for hopelessness. Officially, his title was Special Liaison for Operational Efficiency, a name so blandly bureaucratic, so utterly devoid of meaning, it was practically designed to be ignored, a cloak of invisibility woven from red tape. He was there under a new, and completely fictional, federal initiative to have military logisticians observe and improve the Bureau of Prisons' most challenging facilities, a perfect cover story for a man who specialized in operating in plain sight. In reality, he was a ghost, a scalpel sent by a shadowy subset of the Department of Justice to find the source of a financial rot that budget reports and internal audits just couldn't explain, a cancer that was metastasizing within the federal prison system. He was met at the echoing front gates by Warden Marcus Thorne, a man who wore his profound exhaustion like a second skin, the fabric of his uniform seeming to sag under its invisible weight. Thorne had the weary, hollowed-out eyes of a career bureaucrat who had traded his youthful ideals for bitter survival a long, long time ago, bartering away his principles one small compromise at a time. He'd seen eager reformers come and go, their faces bright with purpose, and he'd watched Blackwood, the living, breathing entity of the prison itself, chew up every single one and spit out their bones. "Major Shaw," Thorne greeted him, his handshake as limp and lifeless as a dead fish, a perfunctory gesture devoid of any warmth or sincerity. "Welcome to the jungle. My advice: keep your head down, stay in your office, write whatever report they need you to write, and for God's sake, don't poke the bears. Some of them have very powerful, very well-connected friends." Shaw just nodded, his calm, unreadable demeanor giving nothing away, his eyes absorbing every detail of the warden's defeated posture, the slight tremor in his hand, the way he avoided direct eye contact. He wasn't there to poke the bears. He was there to study their habitat, to map their feeding grounds, to understand the very ecosystem that allowed them to grow so fat and powerful. Blackwood wasn't just a prison, it was a kingdom. The towering concrete walls and razor wire were merely the border. Inside, a different, unwritten set of laws applied. Laws written not by the government, but by wealth, influence, and inherited power. Thorne wasn't the king. He was just the castle's caretaker, a glorified groundskeeper allowed to live there as long as he never, ever challenged the real rulers who resided both inside and outside the walls. Shaw spent his first week in total, monastic silence, becoming a part of the grim scenery. He walked the echoing cell blocks, the scent of disinfectant failing to mask the underlying odor of despair and unwashed bodies. He sat in on mind-numbing administrative meetings, listening to the drone of bureaucratic language that concealed more than it revealed. He spent hours in a dusty records room, reading years of supply requisitions, maintenance logs, and incident reports, his mind piecing together a hidden narrative of graft and neglect. He was a shadow in a crisp uniform, his presence noted but quickly dismissed by everyone. The guards saw a temporary nuisance, a box ticker from Washington who would soon be gone. The inmates saw just another suit, another cog in the machine that oppressed them. They were all profoundly, dangerously wrong. They saw a soldier, a bureaucrat, but they should have seen an architect. And he was already drawing the blueprints for a radical and hostile renovation. In the rigid, brutal society of Blackwood, there were inmates, a vast sea of anonymous, powerless men, and then there were the princes. This title, whispered in the shadowy corners of the yard and the mess hall with a toxic mix of resentment and genuine fear, belonged to a small, untouchable clique of prisoners who lived outside the rules that governed everyone else. While such extreme, systemic privilege is a dramatization, the existence of deep-rooted corruption and a thriving contraband economy is a well-documented and persistent issue within the U.S. prison system. In our story, the princes of Blackwood were the sons of the state's two most powerful and influential families, Liam Sterling and Julian Davenport. Their fathers ran sprawling empires built on construction, logistics, and the kind of political grease that kept the wheels of state government turning smoothly in their favor. They were in prison for financial crimes so audacious, so brazenly public, they couldn't be completely ignored, but their sentences were being served in a way that openly mocked the very concept of punishment, turning their incarceration into a mere inconvenience, a temporary relocation. Their cells weren't cells. They were suites, discreetly modified by inmate crews working for a pittance and overseen by compromised guards. They featured better lighting, custom-built furniture shipped in under the guise of Warden's office supplies, and private, soundproofed walls. While other inmates choked down a gray, lukewarm nutrient paste that tasted of despair, the princes enjoyed nightly deliveries of steak and wine, delivered by a thoroughly compromised kitchen staff who were paid handsomely for their service. They had the latest smartphones, high-end laptops, and a private, password-protected Wi-Fi network, a piece of contraband so brazen, so openly used, it served as a daily flex of their untouchable power. They didn't just have a few guards in their pocket, their influence snaked all the way up the chain of command, culminating in the warden's office. Thorne knew, of course. He knew everything. He tolerated it because the alternative, challenging the vast, interwoven Sterling and Davenport families, was not just career suicide, it was a threat to his pension, his reputation, and his quiet life. Shaw first witnessed their reign in person during his third day, in the cavernous, stinking mess hall. The room was thick with the smell of boiled potatoes, stale sweat, and palpable despair. As hundreds of inmates shuffled forward in a grim, silent line for their trays of gray, unidentifiable mush, a guard, Officer Russo, walked in not with a tray, but carrying two insulated bags, the kind used for high-end food delivery. He delivered them with a deferential nod to a specific table in the corner where Liam Sterling and Julian Davenport were holding court, laughing with a few other sycophantic inmates. The rich, savory aroma of grilled steak and garlic sliced through the grim air, a stark olfactory assault on the senses of every other man in the room. Liam Sterling, a young man who had inherited his father's cruel smirk and none of his superficial class, caught Shaw's eye from across the room. He paused, a piece of perfectly cooked filet mignon on the tines of a real metal fork, another blatant, dangerous violation, and held it up with a theatrical flourish. "Major!" he called out, his voice dripping with condescending amusement, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You look like a man who appreciates the finer things in life. Care for a bite? Come on, have a taste of what real power gets you on the inside." The low hum of the room fell into a dead, electric silence. Every eye, from the inmates in line to the guards on the catwalks, was on Major Shaw. It was a power play, a public test of his authority and his nerve, designed to humiliate him and reinforce their dominance. Shaw met Sterling's smug gaze, his own expression a perfect mask of professional neutrality. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice perfectly even, calm, and carrying easily across the silent hall. "But I'm fine with the standard issue." A ripple of derisive laughter went through the prince's table. "Standard issue?" Julian Davenport scoffed, wiping his mouth with a cloth napkin. "He's a glorified bean counter, Liam. A government drone. He wouldn't know what to do with quality if it bit him." Shaw just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgment, not submission, and went back to his quiet observation, his gaze sweeping the room, logging the reactions of the other inmates, the nervous shifting of the guards. He wasn't offended. He wasn't intimidated. He was gathering data. He had just seen the system in action, the blatant corruption and the soul-crushing arrogance of its chief beneficiaries. It was another valuable, essential piece of the puzzle he was assembling in his mind. The stunt in the mess hall was just a probe, a way to test his reaction. As Shaw continued his methodical, silent work, the prince's provocations became more direct, more personal. They misinterpreted his quiet diligence not as the mark of a professional operator, but as the timid weakness of a bureaucrat. They saw his uniform not as a symbol of federal authority, but as a target for their amusement. The next test came during a routine inspection of C Block, the oldest and most decrepit part of the prison. Shaw was meticulously examining sanitation records, cross-referencing them with maintenance logs for a block known for its crumbling infrastructure, frequent plumbing failures, and rampant mold, all of which was odd, considering its astronomically high maintenance budget. As he moved toward the West Wing, the segregated, upgraded section where the princes lived, a guard, a hulking man named Benson, stepped directly in his way, physically blocking the corridor. "Sorry, Major," the guard said, his eyes refusing to meet Shaw's, instead focusing on a point on the wall just over his shoulder. "Gotta halt the inspection here. We've got a security situation. Warden's orders. We need you to clear the area." Shaw knew, with absolute certainty, there was no security situation. He could feel the smug, watching eyes of Sterling and Davenport on him from down the hall, peering from the reinforced door of their custom wing. The message was as clear as if they had shouted it. "There are doors here you are not allowed to open." He looked at the nervous guard, a man clearly caught between his duty and the powerful inmates who could make his life hell or get him fired. Instead of arguing, instead of asserting the authority he technically possessed, Shaw once again just nodded, a picture of compliance. "Understood," he said simply, and turned away without another word. As he walked off, the sound of the prince's low, triumphant chuckle followed him down the hall. He didn't look back. He just made a mental note, connecting Officer Benson's name to the prince's internal network of control. Warden Thorne later gave him a flimsy, pathetic excuse about a false alarm from a faulty sensor, advising Shaw to focus his efficiency review on the prison's administrative wings. "It's cleaner there, Major," Thorne had said, his eyes pleading. "In every sense of the word." The humiliations grew more personal, more designed to chip away at his authority and his dignity. The true turning point, the moment the line was crossed for good and the mission changed irrevocably, happened on Family Day. For most inmates, this was a tense, sad, supervised meeting in a crowded, noisy room, a few precious minutes with loved ones under the watchful eyes of guards. For the princes, it was a social event, a catered party. Their families, the patriarchs Sterling Sr. and Davenport Sr., arrived not as worried relatives but as visiting dignitaries, sweeping past the lines of other families with an air of absolute entitlement. Shaw was observing the proceedings from a discreet distance, noting the differences in procedure, when Sterling Sr., a bulldog of a man in a $1,000 suit that seemed to strain at his thick neck, approached him directly. He moved with the slow, deliberate swagger of a man who had never in his life been told, "No." "You must be the efficiency expert I've heard so much about," he said, his smile a cold, dead thing that never reached his predatory eyes. As he spoke, he gestured with a glass of sparkling water, and with a movement that was just a little too deliberate to be accidental, sloshed the entire contents of the glass down the front of Major Shaw's pristine dress uniform. The cold liquid soaked his shirt instantly, clinging to his skin. Sterling Sr. didn't even pretend to apologize. Instead, he looked at the dark, spreading stain on the uniform and chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Don't you worry about that, son. My taxes pay your salary. I'm sure we can afford to get you a new shirt." He clapped Shaw hard on the soaked shoulder, a gesture of dominance, not friendship, and walked away to the sound of his son Liam's appreciative laughter. In that moment, Shaw wasn't a major in the United States military, an expert in logistics and psychological warfare. He was sport for the rich and powerful, a prop in their never-ending show of absolute impunity. He stood perfectly still, water dripping from the hem of his uniform onto the polished floor. He felt the burn of 100 pairs of eyes on him, the pity from other families, the fear from the guards, the contempt from the princes. But beneath his calm, unmoving exterior, a switch was flipped. A cold, quiet, and irreversible calculation was made. A line had been crossed. This was no longer an observation. It was now personal. The final straw, the act that sealed their fates, came a week later. Shaw had spent days compiling his preliminary findings, a meticulous and damning collection of data, on a military-grade encrypted laptop. It was a web of graft, negligence, and corruption, all backed by the prison's own doctored records. One morning, he entered his small, windowless office, turned on the laptop, and was greeted by a blank screen. The drive had been completely, professionally wiped. Everything, weeks of work, analysis, and carefully constructed evidence, was gone. All that was left was a single text file on the empty desktop. He opened it. It contained just 5 words. "Stick to your lane, Major." This wasn't just humiliation. This was a direct, surgical attack on his mission, on his very core as an operator. They had used their internal network, their hidden Wi-Fi, to breach his security and erase his work, a final, supremely arrogant declaration that he was powerless, that they controlled every wire, every signal, every person within these walls. Shaw stared at the blank screen, the 5 mocking words glowing in the dim light of his office. There was no anger on his face. No frustration. No sign of defeat. Just a quiet, chilling clarity. They thought they had broken him. They thought they had sent him a message he couldn't ignore. They were right. He got the message loud and clear. They had just given him a new mission. The observer was gone, replaced by the operator. The period of patient data collection was over. It was time for strategic, decisive action. He didn't file a complaint about the laptop. He didn't confront the warden, whose complicity was now beyond any doubt. Any overt move would be useless, immediately blocked by the same corrupt network that protected the princes. His response would be like his investigation: silent, methodical, and total. First things first, he retrieved his real work. The wiped laptop. It was a decoy. As a man experienced in operating in hostile electronic environments, Shaw practiced redundant security as a matter of basic survival. His true findings, updated daily, were stored on a microdrive, a tiny, innocuous chip hidden within the reinforced seam of his uniform belt. The princes, in their arrogance, had only destroyed a carefully prepared copy. His strategy wouldn't be a direct assault. Attacking the Sterling and Davenport families head-on in the legal or political arena would be like throwing pebbles at a fortress. They were too insulated, their lawyers too good, their political connections too deep. So he wouldn't attack their power, he'd turn it against itself. He would use the very systems they had so masterfully corrupted as the instruments of their own spectacular destruction. His weapons would be their own bottomless greed, their blinding arrogance, and the deep-seated paranoia that was endemic to their world of backstabbing and betrayal. He went back to the mountain of paperwork in the records room, but now he looked at it with new eyes, with purpose. He wasn't just looking for inefficiency and graft anymore. He was looking for levers, for structural weaknesses he could exploit. He began where they'd least expect it, where their power was most blatant: the prison's food supply contract. It was the source of their nightly steak dinners, a daily, tangible symbol of their untouchable status. Shaw saw it as an artery, a vital supply line that, if severed, would cause the entire organism to panic. He spent 3 uninterrupted days poring over years of requisitions, manifests, and payment authorizations. The pattern was obvious and obscene. The prison was paying a huge premium for food, a cost far above market rates, yet the quality for the general population was abysmal, barely meeting minimum nutritional standards. The contract was held by a company called Apex Provisions, and a few hours of digging through online business registries revealed it was a subsidiary owned by a shell corporation whose president was Liam Sterling's uncle. The contract itself was a masterpiece of sophisticated graft. It had been pushed through 3 years earlier, bypassing the mandatory public bidding process by invoking a fictional regulation, Emergency Rebidding Clause 7B, which supposedly allowed the warden to skip standard procedure in the event of a catastrophic supply chain failure. That failure, of course, had been entirely manufactured. Shaw cross-referenced the dates and found that the previous supplier had 3 of their delivery trucks mysteriously fail Department of Transportation safety inspections in a single week, creating a sudden, acute supply crisis that only Apex Provisions, by sheer coincidence, was prepared to solve immediately. It was a classic, brutal racket, but it looked legally airtight from the inside, or so they thought. Shaw had found his first lever. With the food contract fully mapped out, Shaw moved to the next pillar of their internal empire, maintenance. Blackwood was visibly falling apart, a monument to decay, yet its maintenance budget was higher than any other federal facility of its size in the entire country. The contracts for sanitation services, plumbing repairs, and electrical work were all held by 3 separate shell corporations that, after another deep dive into obscure ownership records, he traced back to the Davenport family. It was the same scheme, repeated with equal audacity. The companies billed the federal government millions of dollars for premium services, union labor, and top-of-the-line equipment that were never provided. The actual work, when it was done at all, was performed by inmate work crews for pennies an hour. The Davenports were billing the federal government for millions to have prisoners clean their own prison, and then pocketing the difference. This time, the lever Shaw found was even better, a legal time bomb hidden in plain sight. Digging through state legislative archives online, he unearthed a set of obscure state health and safety codes from the early 1990s, written for state-run facilities. The codes were incredibly strict regarding sanitation and electrical standards, far more so than current federal regulations. They had never been repealed, only superseded and forgotten as newer, more lenient federal regulations were adopted. But the prison's original charter, a document he found on microfilm in a county records office, stated that Blackwood, due to a specific land-grant agreement, must adhere to all state and federal codes that were in effect at the time of its construction. Blackwood was built in 1989. The Davenport maintenance contracts were in flagrant violation of these old, forgotten, but still legally binding state rules. He had found it. The entire structure of graft was built on a foundation of sand. The corruption, while systemic and seemingly invincible, was vulnerable. Documented cases of contract fraud in real-world prisons show how such complex schemes can unravel when subjected to precise, external scrutiny. But reports and evidence weren't enough. He knew if he just submitted his findings in a report, it would be buried in bureaucracy, dismissed by the very people who benefited from the system. Evidence is useless without a weaponized method of deployment. He needed to create a scenario where the evidence would be impossible for anyone to ignore. He needed to move from logistics to pure psychology. He identified a perfect catalyst, the Gallagher Group, the large catering supplier that had been muscled out of the Blackwood food contract 3 years ago. They were a family-owned company known for being aggressive, famously litigious, and for holding long grudges, the perfect agents of chaos. Using a burner phone and a newly created anonymous email account from a public library computer 2 towns over, Shaw sent a simple, untraceable message to the public inbox of their corporate legal department. The email named no one and made no direct accusations. It just said, "Review the Emergency Rebidding Clause 7B used for the 2022 Blackwood Federal Penitentiary Food Service contract. Cross-reference the warden's justification with the DOT inspection reports for your 3 trucks from the week of June 15, 2022. You were cheated." That was it. He had planted the seed. The Gallagher's own legendary greed and burning desire for revenge would do the rest. They would launch a legal and political challenge that would be so loud and aggressive it would force an external federal review, an investigation far beyond Warden Thorne's ability to contain or influence. With the external pressure now a ticking clock, Shaw turned his attention inward, to the heart of the prison's power structure. He had to break the powerful alliance between the Sterling and Davenport families. Their unity, their shared interest in maintaining the corrupt status quo, was their greatest strength. He would shatter it with the most corrosive acid available in their world, paranoia. Through another anonymous, untraceable channel, he leaked a small, carefully selected piece of the fraudulent sanitation contract to a mid-level manager in the Davenport construction empire, a man known to be ambitious and nervous. He subtly altered the document's metadata to make it look like it was part of a discovery package being prepared for a plea deal by a law firm that was famously on retainer for the Sterling family. The implied message was simple and terrifying. The Sterlings are about to flip. They're documenting your family's fraud to save themselves. He then executed the same maneuver in reverse. He fed a fabricated piece of evidence, a faked audio transcript suggesting a meeting with federal agents, to a trusted Sterling family associate, making it appear as though the Davenports were compiling a secret file on the food supply racket to use as leverage. He didn't need them to believe it completely, not at first. He just needed to plant a single, poisonous seed of doubt. In a world built on back-channel deals, betrayals, and ruthless self-interest, paranoia was the native language. They would be fluent in its interpretation. Finally, he needed a trigger, a detonator inside the prison itself. He found his perfect pawn in Officer Miller, a young, idealistic guard who was openly resentful of the princes and their blatant disregard for the rules. Shaw had observed Miller for weeks, noting his simmering anger and his fear of the powerful inmates. Shaw didn't bribe or threaten him. He manipulated him with surgical precision. He orchestrated a situation where Miller, during his rounds, would overhear two inmates, whom Shaw had paid with commissary credits, talking about a rumor that Sterling and Davenport were getting nervous about the new major and were planning to frame a guard for the contraband smartphones to create a distraction, and that the new guy, Miller, was the perfect powerless scapegoat. The next day, Shaw accidentally left a file folder in the guard's break room, on a table where he knew Miller took his coffee break. The file was labeled in bold letters, Internal Affairs, Active Informants. Inside, positioned so it would be visible to anyone who couldn't resist a peek, was a list of inmate names. One of them was Liam Sterling. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed piece of psychological theater. But for Officer Miller, it was the confirmation of his deepest fears, the final piece of evidence that his career and freedom were on the line. Suddenly, his simmering resentment turned into raw self-preservation. He was now Shaw's unwitting agent, a time bomb waiting for the right moment to detonate, utterly convinced that he was acting in his own best interest. The board was set. Every piece was in place. The architect was ready to step back and watch it all unfold. The first domino fell exactly 1 week later, with the force of a battering ram. The Gallagher Group, armed with Shaw's anonymous tip and having done their own furious digging, filed a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons, citing contract fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. As Shaw had predicted, the sheer scale and aggression of the suit triggered an immediate mandatory federal review of all active contracts at Blackwood Penitentiary. It was an unstoppable legal force, an external audit that Warden Thorne had no power to halt, delay, or influence. The news hit the Sterling and Davenport families like a thunderclap. Their first instinct was to circle the wagons, to present a united front of denial. But the seeds of paranoia, so carefully planted by Shaw, were already taking root. The Sterlings, seeing that the lawsuit was centered on the food contract, were immediately convinced that the Davenports had leaked the information to sacrifice them and protect their own, more lucrative maintenance rackets. The Davenports, recalling the doctored memo they had received, were equally certain that the Sterlings were cooperating with the feds to get a better deal, offering up the Davenport schemes to save their own skins. Their panicked, frantic attempts to shred documents, wipe servers, and move money offshore only drew more attention from the federal investigators, who were now watching their every move with a microscope. The powerful alliance that had stood for decades began to crack and crumble in a matter of hours, replaced by a flurry of accusations and betrayals. Inside the prison, the princes could feel the heat radiating from their frantic, furious fathers through angry phone calls. Their usual arrogance was replaced by a nervous, volatile hostility. They started lashing out at the guards, convinced one of them had talked, that a snitch had compromised their perfect kingdom. This new aggression only served to solidify the fears of Officer Miller, who now saw a direct threat in every sneer from Sterling and Davenport. The second domino was about to fall. Shaw sent one final anonymous tip, not to the feds, but to a local investigative journalist known for his scathing exposés on prison conditions. The tip was elegantly simple, a list of the obscure, forgotten state health and safety codes from the 1990s that were being violated, and a simple suggestion to compare them to the publicly available maintenance budgets for Blackwood. He then subtly channeled the inmates' existing, simmering anger. He didn't start a riot. That would be too crude, too chaotic. He just let it leak through the prison grapevine, via a few carefully chosen inmates, that a damning report on their inedible food and squalid sanitation, a report that could finally fix their conditions, was being deliberately buried by Warden Thorne to protect his rich friends, the princes. He gave their years of frustration a specific, immediate target. A slow, simmering, collective anger began to build throughout the general population. The stage was now completely set. The day of reckoning arrived not with a bang, but with the cold, swift efficiency of a guillotine. Warden Thorne, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his usual composure completely shattered, stormed into Shaw's small, Spartan office. He threw a tablet onto the desk with a clatter. The screen showed the front page of the state's biggest news website, the headline blazing in bold type, "Blackwood Penitentiary, Millions in Fraud, Decades of Neglect." "What is this?" Thorne demanded, his voice a ragged mix of fury and raw panic. "The Bureau is calling me every 5 minutes. The DOJ has launched a full-blown investigation. This all started the day you arrived, Shaw. What in God's name did you do?" At that exact moment, as if on cue, the prison alarm blared to life, an urgent, piercing shriek that echoed through the entire facility. It wasn't the riot alarm. It was a high-level security threat alert, an alert that originated from C-Block, the Prince's private wing. Officer Miller, convinced that Sterling and Davenport were about to frame him, had finally acted. During his rounds, he had discovered one of the Prince's burner phones and, following protocol for high-level contraband, triggered an alert that required an external tactical team for a full, unannounced search of the entire block, a protocol that completely bypassed the Warden's authority. There was nothing Thorne could do to stop them from tearing apart his prized inmates' luxury suites. As Thorne stared at the security monitor, watching the tactical team breach the entrance to C-Block, his desk phone rang, the sound shrill and demanding. The caller ID glowed ominously, "Department of Justice." Simultaneously, another monitor showed chaos in the mess hall. Hundreds of inmates were standing on the tables, not violently, but in a powerful, unified act of defiance, holding up their trays of gray, disgusting food. It was a silent, powerful protest. On its own, it would have been a manageable incident. But combined with everything else, it was another critical piece of a collapsing puzzle. The Warden's world was imploding in real time, from every possible direction. The lawsuit, the federal investigation, the damning news report, an external tactical team uncovering years of blatant corruption in his prison, a coordinated inmate protest he couldn't control. It was a perfect, inescapable storm. He looked from the chaos erupting on the screens to the one man in the room who was standing perfectly still, perfectly calm. Major Kalen Shaw hadn't moved. "Warden," Shaw said, his voice cutting through the cacophony of the alarms with chilling precision, "I believe my efficiency report is ready. It seems the systemic rot I was sent here to observe was self-correcting. The system, as it turns out, is incredibly responsive. All it needed was a little push." The blood drained from Thorne's face. The push. The anonymous tip to the Gallaghers. The leak to the press. The stoked paranoia between the families. The terrified, manipulated guard. He saw it all in a flash of sickening, horrifying clarity. Shaw hadn't broken a single rule. He hadn't issued a single illegal order. He had simply given the broken, rusted gears of the machine a strategic, calculated nudge, knowing that their own corrupt weight would cause the entire structure to tear itself apart. This fictional scenario reflects how real-world systems of deep-seated corruption can be surprisingly fragile, vulnerable to a catastrophic collapse when key pressure points are applied with precision. The Warden, a man who had survived for decades by bending to power, was finally and utterly broken by a man who truly understood it. He looked at Shaw, the quiet architect of his ruin, and couldn't speak. His mouth hung open, frozen in a mask of disbelief and total defeat, a forgotten casualty in a war he never even knew was being fought. The collapse was total and devastatingly swift. The evidence of contraband, luxury goods, and illicit communication devices recovered from the Prince's cells led to immediate new federal charges against them. The Gallagher lawsuit and the journalist's explosive exposé created a political and public relations firestorm that no amount of money or influence could contain. Faced with mounting irrefutable evidence and the poison of their mutual betrayals, the patriarchs, Sterling Sr. and Davenport Sr., were indicted on a slew of federal charges, ranging from racketeering and wire fraud to conspiracy to defraud the United States. Their corporate empires, built on a foundation of corruption, crumbled under the weight of federal seizures and shareholder panic. Liam Sterling and Julian Davenport, stripped of their power, their money, and their influence, were no longer princes. They were just inmates, anonymous numbers in the system they once owned. They were transferred to a supermax facility in another state to serve out the remainder of their original sentences, plus the new ones, in a 23-hour 8-day concrete box, a stark, brutal testament to their fall from grace. Warden Thorne wasn't charged with a crime, but his career was over, his name forever associated with incompetence and corruption. He was forced into a quiet, disgraceful early retirement, disappearing from public life. The legal and disciplinary processes in the real federal system are far more complex and protracted, but in this narrative of swift, clean justice, the fall was decisive and absolute. Major Kalen Shaw's final report was hailed in Washington as a landmark study in institutional analysis. It was a clinical, brilliant, and utterly impersonal document that detailed the systemic failures and vulnerabilities of Blackwood without ever mentioning the Sterling or Davenport families or the Warden by name. It simply outlined the loopholes in contract law, the forgotten regulations, and the psychological pressure points he had so expertly exploited. It was, in effect, a blueprint for how to break a broken system from the inside out. His mission was complete. He was quietly reassigned to another impossible task in another forgotten corner of the world. There was no parade, no medal, no public recognition. That wasn't his way. His victory was the silent, satisfying click of the machine's gears falling perfectly, irrevocably into place. Justice had been served, not with a fiery explosion of righteous anger, but with the cold, quiet precision of a well-executed plan. The story of Major Shaw shows that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, a gun, or an army, but a blueprint. He used the arrogance, greed, and corruption of his enemies as the very fuel for their own spectacular downfall. But it raises a profound question for all of us. Was this a calculated act of pure justice, a necessary and righteous move to cleanse a deeply corrupt system for the greater good? Or was it the ultimate pro-revenge, a cold and personal vendetta executed on a grand scale, punishment for the humiliation he suffered? If this story of intricate planning and cold justice left you speechless, hit that like button. Tell us in the comments below, was justice truly served, or did the Major go too far, becoming something as cold as the system he dismantled? We read every single comment and want to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming up next.